All right, welcome back to another episode of Expected by Whom with myself, Prashanth Iyer, and as always, Sean Shapiro. Sean, how you doing post-draft lottery?
Yeah, I myself am doing pretty well. It's beautiful weather and up here and everything like that, but obviously not the result I would have handpicked for the draft lottery. I'll leave it at that way to start because Monday night we're watching that and Blackhawks win the draft lottery. So not the cheeriest start to the week that I think all of hockey fans are united right now on that front, right?
Yeah, I think across the board there was unanimous support for the Blackhawks not deserving that pick. They shouldn't have even had a pick, but that's a conversation for a different time. But I think more interestingly is the NHL once again managed to bungle the production of arguably the biggest draft lottery that they've ever had the chance to produce, going back to the McDavid lottery. You know, with on the ESPN side, it seems like Kevin Weeks accidentally leaks Columbus dropping right before break, before that card's flipped. And on the Canadian side, it sounds like Sportsnet had a glitch, and that also revealed the same thing. So kind of fascinating how across two different networks that gets bungled a bit, and ultimately the air gets kind of sucked out of what was supposed to be the most monumental lottery in almost a decade.
Yeah, it was... We know it's not rigged because the NHL did everything in their power to show us it's not rigged. They put the video out. They put they let reporters from the Associated Press, Daily Faceoff, and the Athletic into the viewing process. So we know it's not rigged, but it was bungled. I sometimes we complain about things, and I think it's sometimes people, and rightfully so, we should be picking at this, but we also should come with a solution. And I thought a good friend of mine, Matt DeFranks, who covers the St. Louis Blues, had a pretty good solution for how we run this in the future, where instead of doing the card flipping thing, why don't we just do the ball drawing live? And as it's, because one of the, by the card flipping thing, we only know there's 3 teams. But Matt did a great job of going back and pulling the number combinations, where I think it was after, because they draw 4, it's 5 number combination or 4 number conversation. I think it's a
4 number combination.
Yeah. So after 3 numbers had been drawn, there were still 6 teams that could have won the lottery. Like, that's the drama that I want, where it's like you got 3 balls up, and then you've got, okay, now these 6 teams, and like that's the drama. That's so much better to me than flipping cards. And so, as I mentioned on Twitter, let's let Matt run the draft lottery production next season.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Why don't we do exactly that? We have the first 3 numbers drawn. You eliminate the teams that no longer have combinations that are viable. And then what I want, and maybe you can pitch this to Matt, is throw it over to a big board of Plinko. And I want to see the ball drop from the top. And there's just going to be all that drama of where it's going to go. And sure, you can weight the number of slots at the bottom by the amount of combinations the team has left to win. But that's what I want. Give me that. Just give me, everybody hanging on the ball, hitting every single pin on the way down that Plinko board until it finally lands where it's going to go.
Oh, that'd be amazing. That would be amazing. And then you're taking care of transparency. The quote unquote rigged calls become less. They don't become as boisterous, and just that's amazing to watch. That's theater, right? And then you get to do it twice. Like, just think about it twice, because I remember there's 2 drawings. There's drawings for number 1 and number 2. So we do the number 1 drawing, and then all of a sudden we've got that, and it's an amazing moment. They're like, all right, well, now we do it again, and it would be great TV. Great TV.
Well, folks, welcome to Expected by Whom, a podcast where we have excellent ideas such as a Plinko-based draft lottery. But we're a podcast that explores the world of hockey through unique lenses, brought to you by the Wing Wheel Podcast. We know a lot of you tuning in are Red Wings fans, and the Wing Wheel Podcast is the biggest and best Detroit Red Wings show out there. Find the show wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts, and go to wingwheelpodcast.com for more. So, we've already kicked off one great idea and one great conversation with a Plinko-based draft lottery. Let's shift into another conversation, something that's kind of been percolating in the Twitter sphere, if you will. Challenges with playoff performers. Are there certain types of players that are better suited to play in the playoffs? This has really come up with, Mitch Marner and the core four in Toronto struggling. It's come up with Jason Robertson sort of struggling to get on the board in Dallas. What's your take on, are there certain players maybe better fit to produce in the playoffs than others?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see the narratives, some right, some wrong, as they've developed with this. And for me, I was curious to pick some other brains on this. So this morning, after in our amazingly efficient production strategy where we have an idea and then throw it together an hour before we come on air, I texted some people from NHL teams about it, and to throw my theory is that while there is an intensity, it's the playoffs, it's tough factor, I really think a lot of it comes from you play the same team 4 to 7 times in a row, and everyone knows everyone's tendencies by the end of game 2. So you take and it's also actually, and so when the Devils and Rangers were playing each other, and now they played each other a lot in the regular season too, so it picks up even more so right off game 1. Every Rangers player knows what the Devils are trying to do. They know where they can hit the guy without blowing coverage. They know where they can do this. I think a lot of these guys who are quote unquote, who get labeled as quote unquote regular season players who have a lot of points and then struggle in the playoffs, I think it's more so, from my view, where they're always focusing on their game in the regular season. And then in the playoffs, the other team is actually focusing on them just as much, because it's all of a sudden it's about containing them. For the core four in Toronto, for right now, Florida's job is to contain them for 4 games. In the regular season when they played, their job was just to contain them for 1 game. You're not going to dedicate everything to it, every resource to it. I think that's the biggest thing, where we're seeing kind of the familiarity and the breakdown of it. It's not as much it gets tougher. It just becomes more of a chess match, is really my view of it.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, the other reason why this gets magnified so much is the sample size. Over the course of an 82-game regular season, you are going to have highs and lows. You're going to have slumps. You're going to have peaks. Every great player goes through it. There is no player that's scoring in every single game. Even Connor McDavid's going to go a couple of games without points. That happens. But in a playoff series where it's win or go home, and you've got a 7-game series against a team that is intimately keying on you and learning your tendencies as that series goes along, it does become exponentially harder to score. And that's where I think when you have scenarios where a player goes on a hot streak, like we're talking about Leon Draisaitl right now, potentially shattering the NHL record for goals in a postseason, because the guy's on an absolute heater. But in terms of the quality of chances he's generating at 5-on-5, it's actually no different than what John Tavares is doing. He's just on an absolute heater right now. The puck's going in the net, and he's got the benefit of a power play that's clicking at 60% over in Edmonton. That's going to get him a lot of goals. And so when you step back and sort of just look at the big picture for some of these guys like a Marner, like a Robertson, these guys are really, they're almost point per game players in the playoffs. It's just they have such high standards for them in the regular season, and that these playoffs happen in such short chunks that if you just have that slump for a couple of games, or that team finds a way to shut you down for a couple of games, everything is magnified. And Wings fans may remember this. This happened with Pavel Datsyuk. Over Datsuk's first 42 playoff games, he had 15 points. That is very minuscule for a guy that is regarded as one of the most dominant two-way centers of the last 20 years. The guy was at a point every 3 games. And that's something that can't happen. And that was a large part of the reason why the Wings struggled in 03, 04, and 06, getting bounced relatively early in the playoffs. But it took him some time. He figured it out, and he figured out how to take his game to the next level. And so I think that's a little bit of what you're seeing here, is that small sample size really magnifies a player's struggles in the postseason.
And I think sometimes too we don't apply some of the outside control factors that we need to. And you mentioned Tavares versus Draisaitl earlier. Would you rather face the goaltending that Draisaitl has faced in the first 2 rounds or the goaltending Tavares has faced in the first 2 rounds? I think sometimes we forget the control factor there, where Draisaitl has been, what he's been doing is great. Take nothing away from what he's been doing, but it's not like he has gone and done this against a collection of the NHL's top goaltenders. He's done it against Vegas, who has been okay, and he did it against LA, where it's on the flip side, Tavares has faced better goaltending. I think those control factors sometimes get lost when we try to pull guys out of series and break it down that way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, when we talk about playoff series, a lot of times we mention a team got goalied. We mention a goalie gets on that hot streak and gets going, and those are control factors that, you just can't handle. You can't really account for when you're going and looking at a player's postseason performance. And yes, you should, people are going to make the case, well, if you're this elite scorer or this elite skater, you should find a way to go. But we've sort of seen over the years that goaltending has beaten elite offense more often than not. Now, this year may end up being an exception when the offense is as elite as it's been in Edmonton and in some of these other places. But, historically speaking, when a goalie gets on a heater, it's almost impossible to beat him. I mean, you look at Ottinger last year, it was incredible that, Calgary managed to take it to him, because he was on another level last year. And, we've seen Vasilevsky do this for the last 3 years, and he finally had a breakdown this year, and the Leafs were able to capitalize. But more often than not, these goalies are gonna win out. And if you run into, a J.S. Jaguar in 2003, good luck. Sorry. You're not scoring against him. I mean, it is what it is. So I think that's a really important contextual factor that you bring up there, when we're evaluating, who's truly a playoff performer and who's not.
And I think the other thing that we get lost in the narrative and the glamour of guys who they get too much credit for being playoff performers. The guys who, really, they're probably nothing more, or not nothing more. They're an NHL player, but they're typical. It's the typical third line guy who all of a sudden we're like, oh, they play a playoff style, and they come in and they do that. And it's funny because you look at their numbers a lot of the times, and they're not doing anything different than they did in the regular season. It's just now they're more annoying because more hits are thrown in the playoffs because they can sell out for bigger hits. They can, not bigger hit. We're not saying like the big open ice hits, but you know what I mean, where they can go out of their way to intercept routes that against the same guys they played against the entire time, familiarity and everything like that. And so it's on the flip side too. We fall in love with these, especially from a media perspective in the broadcast. We always hear about, oh, this guy's a great playoff performer. And so often it's like, I mean, he's the exact same guy he was in the regular season, like 90% of the time.
So you're telling me that I shouldn't place a bet on Jordan Martinook winning the Rocket Richard next year? Exactly the kind of guy you're talking about right now, a guy who has just been on an absolute heater, has 9 points against the Devils this series, but he had 0 against the Islanders in that first round. But Martinook's exactly that type of player, the third line, gritty forward, hits a lot, big energy guy, and right now everything's going in for him. And even in Detroit, we've been enamored with that type of player. You go back in the Darren McCartys, the Kirk Maltbys, the Chris Drapers. Those were your grind line players that came up big. And even before them, Bob Probert in 1988 went on an absolute heater, had 21 points in the postseason, which was a Red Wings franchise record for a while. So it's, you get those runs from those guys who find the moment, and we sort of enamor them and fall in love with what they've done. But they're really, like you said, they're not doing anything fundamentally different. It's just when the officiating standard maybe tightens up a little bit, and they're not calling as much, the intensity ramps up, the hitting ramps up. These guys just find a way that their game sort of shines through a little bit more. And again, these small samples really magnify things. I mean, Martinook, I think, is 1 point away from setting a Hurricanes record for points in a series. And it's like, no one would have thought it's Jordan Martinook that's going to be the one doing that. But it's just sometimes the way the puck bounces and things work out for him.
It's been interesting, too, to watch. Martinook's a great segue on this, too, because to see the way Carolina plays, and we've seen them against the Devils in this series, and then to see what Seattle's done, because Seattle is, they're not as, like Carolina is really in a class in itself in the way they forecheck in the way, but Seattle is almost a West Coast version of Carolina in many ways in the way they forecheck. And it's interesting to see those teams. And I think for the entire year, Carolina and Seattle, even though they have bigger name players in Carolina, but they kind of get lumped in as, oh, they come in waves. They're throughout the regular season. We just look at them as an individual unit. And then now that it comes down to the playoffs, and this is more from a national landscape, comes to the playoffs, and where, okay, now we start to dissect it a bit more, where no one's really dissecting the swarmy Hurricanes in the regular season. It's just, oh, Rod Brendamore and crew come to town and they just run you through a wall. Now we have 7 games where we actually have to stop, not us, but the general media coverage has to actually stop and decide, oh, who are those people running people through walls? And I think that's the other thing that just starts to develop from these playoff series. And it's really interesting to see what's happening in Carolina. We obviously expected them to be this good. And then Seattle kind of a couple weeks back when we had Shayna on, I remember we asked Shayna, like, why does no one replicate the Hurricanes? And maybe the question should have been, is Seattle replicating the Hurricanes? Because it's very similar in how those two things have kind of played out.
Yeah, without a doubt, Seattle's probably your closest comparison, and Dave Hackstall's system is similar in terms of where shots are maybe preferred from, largely perimeter with that aggressive forecheck and puck recovery emphasis there. And, they're absolutely a team that fits that bill. And I think the other thing we should also maybe step back and recognize is we're always enamored by the third line player, the gritty player that's coming out and scoring, the Jordan Martinooks. But I think it's also important to remember the scenarios where it doesn't work out. We looked at Tampa, right? What did Tampa give up for Tanner Jeannot this year? Because Tanner Jeannot is that type of player.
Yeah.
Tanner Jeannot was the guy that you thought was going to come out, be the aggressive, the hitter, the guy that would be able to play the big minutes and score those dirty, greasy goals. And it didn't work out for Tampa this year. Now, obviously, he had some injury issues and whatnot that may have limited his efficacy. But another example is Garnet Hathaway in Boston. They go out and they get him from Washington specifically to be that type of difficult to play against player. And it doesn't work out in the same capacity that we've seen with the Jordan Martinook. And so I think it is important to balance those. And maybe those players aren't remembered as often because you weren't expecting them to raise their game in the playoffs. And we don't remember those examples there, but we always seem to remember the ones where the guy substantially raises their game and takes it to the next level. And those are the guys like the Nathan Hortons from Boston, was a guy who always raised his game, Joel Ward, Devontae Smith-Pelly, those types of guys that have those big playoff runs and they really cement themselves in the lore of the playoffs and the style of player. But we should remember all the players that fit the similar archetype that don't have that same level of success.
I really, on a side note, I really want the Predators won't do it because David Poile is his last draft. But I would really love because I think they have of all the picks they got, obviously they're spread out over time a little bit, but I think 3 of them or 4 of them are in 2023 in Nashville. And so I would love I would love just a nice like nod to Tanner Jeannot, like maybe I think the first one in 2023 is like the round 3 pick from that deal, where it's like you could send like Pekka Rinne up to announce the pick or something, because they're going to have all of the Predators. Rinne's going to announce some picks. Barry Trotz is only probably going to. David Poile's going to get the first and last pick probably. But I'd like at some point they should invite Tanner Jeannot to announce the picks. That would be a nod that would really. Give me the full chaos. That will never happen on that one.
I can't imagine a more fitting scenario to just pull out Tanner Jeannot at the Nashville draft and have him come up and acknowledge that deal that gave all these picks to Nashville that has now allowed them to draft whoever they end up drafting. I think that would be absolute chaos, perfect comedic timing, and therefore will never happen in the NHL.
Yeah, it's the NHL. It's to everyone who we opened up at the top of the hour or whatever. That's a very radio-ish, whatever. We opened the show with the draft lottery. If you think the NHL can rig things, you're giving the NHL too much credit sometimes. So.
Yeah, I mean, they can barely get through, presenting the information correctly after it's already been done a couple hours before. Let's not give them too much credit. This isn't the 1985 NBA draft that's getting rigged for Patrick Ewing to go to the New York Knicks, or Tim Duncan's draft getting rigged to go to the San Antonio Spurs. This isn't that. The NHL doesn't have the capacity to pull that off. So let's not give them too much credit here. And so with all of that being said, we're going to shift gears a little bit here, and we're going to bring on a friend of mine who you may be familiar with. Her name is Carlie Markey. She's an analyst for the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Boston Pride in the PHF. And what she's going to talk to us a little bit about is how the PHF has sort of had their analytics renaissance, similar to what we've had in 2014 in the NHL, when we saw a lot of big names like Eric Tulsky, Tyler Dello, and whatnot get hired. That's sort of happening right now, real time in the PHF. And there's a lot of opportunities, for people who have asked us where to kind of break into hockey analytics. There's a ton of opportunities right now in women's hockey. And so Carlie's going to come on and talk to us a little bit about her experience, and kind of share a little bit more information on ways to get involved in women's hockey analytics. Joining us today, very excited, it sounds like for the very first time on a podcast, is Carlie Markey, analyst for the Pittsburgh Pirates, as well as the Boston Pride. So Carlie, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we are tremendously excited to have you here because for those of you that don't know, Carlie's probably one of the most humble but prolific individuals that I've ever encountered. An astrophysicist that is also doing analytics work in both baseball and hockey and has presented at so many different conferences, can basically do everything. It is amazing that it took until 2022 for a team to snap you up, but it sounds like the PHF is maybe moving in that direction, and we had a pretty big offseason for the PHF in terms of analytics signings to the different organizations.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, you mentioned it's surprising I haven't gotten snapped up. It's not that people haven't tried, right? But I was really waiting for that right fit in the right moment, because I was pursuing my PhD last year and really last fall, after going back a little bit, back to the summer, it started getting more and more evident that a PHF team was going to hire an analyst, just because internally, behind the scenes, me, Alyssa Longmuir, Mikhail Nahabadine, Mike Murphy, we had all been pushing behind the scenes and at conferences and on Twitter. And it was kind of like, okay, who's the first domino that's going to go? Right. And I was like, I thought it was going to be Alyssa, because she's just been at this for so long. But it actually ended up being Mikhail, who is with the Force, as most of us know. And it was a great hire by them. And he ended up bringing on Alyssa Longmuir, and actually a couple other people over the last year. And then I got snapped up by Boston. And I believe a couple of other teams have some analytics interns, or some people who have, touch on that area, some coaches or something. But yeah, so last summer really was kind of the pushover, and as soon as I kind of saw that, I was like, well, why am I doing the PhD when my dream job's over here, right? So, yeah, it was quite the off season, and I'm very happy.
Yeah, I mean, it's awesome that there's finally been that push, and that finally the first domino, like you said, fell, and in the NHL, it took a while for that to happen as well. It took until 2014 when all of a sudden, Eric Tulsky, Tyler Dello, Sonny Maeda, and all of the, people who had been doing it for a long time, just like yourself, Mikhail, Mike, and Alyssa had been doing it for a long time. All of a sudden, those dominoes fall and all of the other organizations start to catch up. And so do you sort of see that shift maybe happening in the PHF? And sort of beyond that, I was wondering if you could just sort of generally talk about your experience, working with the PH team for this first year.
Yeah. So, in regards to your first question, I think, the goal for it, like on the public side, obviously, and I've said this for years, is to get women's hockey teams, whether that be in the PHF or on the PWHPA side, to, hit the ground running with analytics, right? Within the NHL, like they're, the quote unquote eye test and video review has just been ingrained for so long, for decades and decades, right? That it was a really big pivot to, being data driven, right? So the idea was, instead of needing to do that pivot, what if we can help these teams hit the ground running and start from the get-go being data-driven, and instead of having this, years and years and years lead up, squish that all into a couple years. And that is part of why I'm at the Pirates as well, just so I can have that, institutional support from a men's team, which has been really awesome on their part. But I think it's going really well, honestly. Of course, you still have, challenges because it is hockey and there is just so limited resources. I guess I can't get any more specific than that. But it's been really awesome. And I know that up the Forest, they've been having a really great time up there. So I think the conversation around data is a lot more open in women's hockey, both behind the scenes and in public, that I think it is on the men's side.
Yeah. It's fascinating that you bring that up, because in my very limited experience, just working on the Cat Bestie site with Alyssa and Mike, and, them, it is very encouraging to see kind of how much more open the conversation is. Yeah. I think across the spectrum, at least being able to view it from the public side. And I think building a lot off of the momentum of, you've now got the ESPN broadcasting deal with, PHF picking up the games for the next couple of years. It's really worked to increase the accessibility. And I think we've sort of seen that, with the PHF games. And then even further, I think getting into the IIHF and the Worlds, there's been so much tremendous work done from you in the past, from Ann Wynn, who I definitely have to shout out all of her amazing work. And then Alyssa, obviously, over the years. So really, from my standpoint, and maybe you can expand on this, now more than ever, there's so many different opportunities for people in the public sphere to get into women's hockey analytics, between the accessibility of the game in the PHF all the way through the World's data, where you can get all the shot coordinate data from the World's games. So, talk a little bit about kind of how much that accessibility has really helped, or how you think it may help grow the game even further.
Yeah, so that has been a very conscious push of me and Alyssa, I think, in the last year or two. And always Mike, who is, always gung-ho with his spreadsheets. Really, really amazing what he does with just Google Sheets. But I think that now that me, Mikhail, and Alyssa have kind of vacated that public role of, making visualizations, talking about statistics, and talking about projects that we're doing publicly, there's a huge void left in women's hockey, right? Mike is still there, Anne is still there doing incredibly awesome things, right? But, you're three people who are huge content producers that aren't there any longer, right? But the data is still there, and the tools are still there. And there's still a lot of people who want to see it, right? And I think that the foundation has been laid, right? For instance, like Ben Howell wrote a PHF scraper, and is working on, scraping the NCAA, the SDHL, Naisten Liga, all of these other European leagues. So, quite frankly, women's hockey, I don't think faces a data problem anymore. It's a personnel problem, right? It's okay, who wants to work on it, right? There's, the barrier of entry, I think, is so low with, the tools Anne has built, and, the data availability that people, like Alyssa and Ben, and Mike have done, to really connect the people to the data, so.
Yeah, and it's awesome that you bring that up, because I think one of the most common questions I get asked from folks is, how do I break into sports analytics? How do I break into hockey analytics? And generally my advice is, you have to sort of have a project in mind. You go out, you tackle the project, and then you find a way to share that information with people. And yeah. I think too often we don't mention that there's a lot of data available for women's hockey. And beyond that, there's a lot of opportunities to be able to present that information. Recently, Megan Chayka with the Big Data Cup, over the last couple of years has used PHF data and actually gotten people to work, with PHF data, present that to, high level organizations, folks along those lines. And then you yourself, we're now coming up on the 3rd annual Women's Hockey Analytics Conference. And so I believe you have some exciting news to share on that front.
Yeah, I don't know if this is where it might drop, but this will definitely be a cutting edge announcement. Wacky Hack will be on July 15th this year. And we are once again doing a kind of submission competition type thing, where we'll once again have PW data and are asking people to submit a project TBD on details on that. But there's, if you want to present something in women's hockey data, we have a spot for you at our conference. And especially, with OTHAC not happening this year, I believe we'll be among the first. I mean, LINHAC was happening in June, but, second conference of the year, right? So
yeah, and
happy to take those projects.
Absolutely. And beyond that, I think, people should really go back and check out the prior agendas from these, because I think first and foremost, the barrier to doing this conference is very different because it's a one-day online conference, right? You're not flying anywhere. There's not hotels that need to be done. It's a one-day conference that you can participate from online. It offers itself to a wider array of folks who want to participate. There's not that same cost barrier of entry. And then if you go back and you look at all of the topics over the last few years, or last couple of years, I should say, it's been amazing. I mean, you go back last year, there's presentations on computer vision, player tracking. Yeah. You've got Tableau tutorials. Yeah. You've got panels, moderated by Shayna and Allison, two of the most prominent NHL voices who still go out of their way to spend time promoting, women's hockey and women's hockey analytics. You've got folks like Sean Tierney, who works with SportLogic now and is still coming in and participating in those conferences. So I think it's really, if, me speaking broadly to the audience of this type of podcast, it's for all of you who have asked me so many times, where do I get started? Where do I go from here? As Carlie mentioned, there's so much data available in women's hockey. There's a void in terms of a need of analysts to step in and kind of start advancing the field with, you, Alyssa and Mikhail all being hired. And there's opportunities to present it. There's opportunities at the Women's Hockey Analytics Conference. And then beyond that, there's also opportunities with the Big Data Cup to participate there. And there's opportunities to even take this data and present it at other hockey analytics conference. You're not limited to just right here. And so really what I'm trying to encourage people is, there's a void here. Step in and fill it. Yeah, step in and fill it.
I have always said that if you do a women's hockey project, I will reblog it or retweet it or whatever the term is these days on whatever platform we're on. I will put it in front of whatever audience I have, because it's important to not only me, but to, the wider women's hockey community who wants to see those projects. I mean, there's still a bunch of areas in women's hockey that we haven't looked at that I will never get to look at publicly because I'm with the team now, right? So having people explore, stuff like in men's versus women's hockey, what is the pace of play like, right? Even stuff as basic as that, right? Just counting the rate of shots. We have no idea, right? Publicly. So I would love to see that. I would love to see any project that people come up with. And honestly, we've taken projects for Wacky Hack that haven't even been fully finished, and that have still been really cool to see, because I think in a lot of times, especially with these conferences and stuff like the Big Data Cup, you see this huge, amazing, incredible, finished, polished object. But, it's messy to get there, right? And I think there's something worth seeing the guts of a project as it's happening, too. So we'll take those as well. Love to see it. And I also had another thought, but I forgot it. Oops.
That is no worries at all. It's honestly, there's always so many things going on. But one other thing I wanted to highlight about the Hockey Analytics Conference you guys have coming up is one of the other unique things that I think helps with the barrier of entry is you guys have done a partner system where you've had project mentors actually sign up to assist people who maybe have an idea and aren't sure how to develop it all the way through, or need a little bit more expertise from someone who's done that. And so you have the opportunity to get paired up with some really smart people who have a vetted interest in seeing you succeed in your project and seeing you succeed in your presentation. And that's another, again, opportunity to really get your foot in the door, to talk with other folks and find ways to advance your sort of portfolio of work. I mean, I can't say enough about the opportunities that are currently available. And so more and more and more people, please step up to the bat. There's an opportunity here. There's a void. There's space. There's data. And Carlie would love to see it at the Women's Hockey Analytics Conference this summer. So, I think that's tremendous. Beyond that, Carlie, I want to talk a little bit, more beyond these conferences. We talked a lot about kind of ways for folks to get in the door, but sometimes people don't even know where to take the first step. Do you have suggestions on potentially where people can turn to even take that first step getting in the door?
Yeah. So what I like to tell people is, there's kind of two different approaches that I tell people to take. The first one is, if you have questions you want answered, go try and figure out, those questions yourself, right? That's kind of how I got started, trying to figure out, stuff basically when I was a tiny child, all of 17, I was trying to figure out something like expected goals, but you look into that and you're like, oh, someone's already done that, right? But then you're like, oh, I wonder this other thing, right? And you start going down this rabbit hole of questions to start answering, right? And the best way to start answering those questions, I think, is honestly plug it into Tableau. There's a reason why we've had Tableau tutorials in Wacky Hack the past 2 years, and we'll have another one this year probably, because it's just such an easy tool to visualize data, and that's the most important thing, I think, for that first step, being able to understand how to look at the data, not even to work with it, but even how to think about it, right? If you can't visualize it in your head, you can't work with it. And Tableau is a really great intermediary step to start having it like a helping hand on how to think about that. And once you figure out, let me plot this scatter plot or make a little bar graph or something, then you can start moving on to R and ggplot and more fancy technical softwares. But Tableau is a great start. Honestly, I still do things in Excel. I love a good Excel formula. Like I said, Mike does stuff in Google Sheets. The basics are the basics for a reason, right? So I was just starting to answer those questions. And I would be disingenuous if I didn't mention Shot Plotter as another tool, which is like, honestly, again, I still use Shot Plotter in the work that I do, right? You'd like, okay, so last year, I was working with Chatham women's team, and I was thinking about like, do takeaways with physical contact or takeaways with not physical contact? Like, which is more effective, right? You can track some games and answer that question really quickly, right? So, just finding those questions to answer and then figuring out the next steps, baby steps on how to answer those, right? And then the ball starts rolling. My second approach is if you are somehow connected with the team. I know there's, a fraction of people who kind of start out with the team and are like, okay, but how do I do this analytics thing? Ask your coach what he wants to know or what she wants to know. Because when you're working with a team, my philosophy is the only useful information that you can give your coach is the one they want to hear, right? Because like there's not really a point to telling your like coach being like, oh, blah 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 XG, the shots on goal, and they're like, I don't know what XG is, and because like that's where communication breaks down. So you got to talk about the same kind of thing and have the same kind of conversation, and use them as a repository of knowledge, right? Because they've watched the game for a really long time, right? They have a lot of institutional knowledge you can draw from. And then that way you can start figuring out the process, right? And still go on that little exploration through Excel or Shot Plotter or whatever. So that's what
that's a terrific answer. And I think you bring up 2 points that I want to highlight for everybody. And one is how you choose to present information. Is critical. Everybody could have the same information, but if you don't have a method of presenting it in a manner that's digestible and easy to understand, you'll often find that it's harder to communicate your point. And, for folks who are maybe more familiar with NHL visualizations, I mean, you see people like Dom Luszczyszyn who have, he was on our last episode. Yeah. He does everything in numbers. So he doesn't do any coding, right?
That. Yeah, right.
Right? So he does everything in numbers, but he has an uncanny ability to generate visualizations that resonate with people. And when in women's hockey is the same way right now in the public space. You mentioned Shot Plotter and created that. And, with Anne being able to put that together, people can actually plot data points on a rink to generate information.
Yeah, it's crazy.
For themselves. And then, it's that kind of stuff where if you can even just get a handle on how to present information, whether it's via an Excel graph, whether it's via Tableau, like you mentioned, I think that's a critical spot to start. And then the second point you brought up is in terms of how you communicate information. You may be the smartest person in the room. You may know everything there is to know. Yeah. But if you can't communicate that knowledge to somebody else, you'll find that you struggle to have a meaningful conversation. And that's where people like Allison Lukan have been so critical in the NHL.
Absolutely.
Right. She's one of the best in the business at just being able to explain stuff, explain what the core concept is. And, you're bringing up how you talk to a coach. That coach isn't dumb. That coach is very, very smart. They've spent a lot of time watching the game. They've played the game likely. They have a ton of experience around the rink, but you're just talking in 2 different languages. So how do you break down that barrier, and how do you figure out how you present and communicate information to them ultimately is what makes you successful. So you absolutely can take those initial steps by simply just figuring out how to explain or present information that maybe already exists. You're not being tasked with creating anything, creating a new statistic or anything like that. That's not the barrier. It's how do I present this information that's currently available? And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for that in women's hockey with all of the data that's available. And there's so many, and there's so many good role models still in the public space, particularly have to shout out Anne, the work being done at the Ice Garden, under Mike Murphy. I mean, they've done a tremendous job. The Twitter user, I forget his name, but it goes, the bucket list.
Yeah.
Does a tremendous job.
My hero.
Yeah. I mean, unbelievable with rank visualizations, around, especially some of the computer vision stuff and player tracking that he's been able to do. I think absolutely tremendous. So all that being said, there's a lot of opportunities here. The whole point of bringing Carlie on the show was to be able to explain, this is an analytics revolution that's happening in the PHF. It's just started.
Real time.
Yeah, it's in real time. It's get in. Let's go have fun. Let's work with the data. Let's learn something, and go win an Isabella Cup, right? And make some stuff happen. You're with the Boston Pride. They're obviously rich got richer, bringing you on. Although the season didn't turn out, maybe the way you were hoping for, but I gotta imagine next year looks just as bright and just as much fun for you.
Oh, it does. It does.
Well, Carlie, I want to thank you for again taking the time to hop on the show with us today. Is there, for people that want to find a little bit more of your prior work, I know you've got a website that you maintain. I was hoping you could take a few seconds to just plug that and potentially share some resources for people.
Yeah, so my website with all my past projects is just carliemarkey.com, full name, CarleenMarkey.com. I'm on Twitter at Quirky Hockey. My GitHub is cmarkey. I don't think I have any other places things live, I think. And one day, Meta Hockey will be back up.
One day.
That's another podcast interview.
Yes. That's another one where we'll have to bring you back to talk about how you resurrected it after I let it go by the wayside. But ultimately, can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us, share all of your insight, your expertise. Aww. Best of luck on the rest of the Pirate season. Best of luck on next year's Boston Pride season. And hopefully not a stranger to this podcast, and we get to have you back on soon enough.
Yeah, hope so too. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Carlie. Thank you again to Carlie for joining us. And again, if anyone has any questions or where to find some of the resources that Carlie mentioned, we'll have all of those linked in the episode webpage here. And in the meantime, if you'd like to support our show, subscribe to the Wing Wheel Podcast on Patreon. That's patreon.com/wingwheelpodcast. By subscribing, you're not only unlocking more great benefits like Wing Wheel Podcast's exclusive Discord, which does have an Expected by Whom dedicated channel, bonus episodes, and more. You're also supporting us as we're a part of the Wing Wheel Podcast Content Network. All right, so we've had a lot of great ideas already on this show. We talked about Plinko drafts. We've talked about, the myth maybe of the playoff performer. Sean, I want to kick it to you now because you've got another great idea on potentially how we could optimize the NHL schedule as it pertains to the draft lottery.
Yeah, I think for this whole exercise, we have to establish, first off, that we all agree that there is some inherent flaw in sports fandom right now where we go into a space at the end of the season where you have teams rooting, you have fans of teams would rather see their team lose than win. It's just such a, it's hilarious. That's not the point of sports. You're supposed to win games. And I've always been a system I think that is great where you avoid this in sports is promotion and relegation. Promotion and relegation is not possible in North American sports. I've accepted that as much as I can raise the flag and push for it on Twitter sometimes. I know that it will never happen in North American sports. I understand how this business works too much. But I do think, and I brought this idea up in December, and I published it over at my website, Chap Shots, but I'll bring it up again because I was just thinking about it this week, how with the draft lottery and essentially the Blackhawks tank worked, and Blackhawk fans throughout the season, every loss, they were more thrilled, and it's kind of silly. And in paying attention here in Detroit, it was a very weird space to be because you wanted to win more games, but at the same time, you felt bad because, well, are we missing out on a better chance to draft a generational talent? So The plan that I have thrown together is, and it's revamping the NHL schedule in this way, where there's 32 teams in the NHL, and we split the season into essentially two parts, the regular season into two parts. Every team plays every other team once, so that's 31 opponents. You play home and away. That gives you a 62 game sample size. At that 62 game sample size, we split the league into a top 21 teams, and those top 21 teams, you play every other team in the top 21 time. And from those top 21, you get your 1 through 16 playoff bracket. And it's an equal schedule. Everyone who's in the top third of the league, you've played every team in the league twice, and you've also played the teams in your tier three times, because you played them once in the last 20. In the bottom third of the league, the bottom 11 teams for this exercise, you have a home and away. You basically, those teams are out of the playoffs after 62 games, which is essentially what they are right now anyway. That basically is where teams are. But now, instead of playing for losses and better ping pong balls, you're in a spot where these 11 teams are playing each other, the other 10 teams, home and away over the final 20 games of the season. That's how you get your schedule, and that's how we keep the 82-game format, because NHL owners will never go down on games. They're always going to, each home game is worth around $2.75 million or $3 million now or whatever in revenue, so owners aren't going to give that up. Players aren't either, because of revenue sharing, to be clear, as much as players will push it. I mean, at the end of the day, it is about money. So you get that, but those teams in the bottom third now are now playing they get a reset, and they're playing the team that has the most points in the bottom 11. They get the number one pick. Second best points gets the second pick, and so on and so forth. And essentially, it becomes the spot where every single game you're going in, both fan bases, at least in the last 20 games of the season, everyone has a reason to win the game. There's no reason not to win the game. You're playing for something. And I know sometimes the argument is, players would never play for a draft pick. That's in that playoff tournament process. Players don't tank. Players are always playing for the next job. Coaches are always coaching for the next job. They're always trying to win. So even if you slightly change the stakes for those bottom teams who didn't have much to play for anyway, it's not going to change much. It's just going to change who the GMs maybe ice and maybe put a better product. I understand there are always flaws in any plan, but I'm throwing it out there, and I'll let you start picking it apart.
Honestly, it's an interesting plan, and it's actually very closely related to a plan that gets talked about a lot, the gold plan. The major difference being you're sort of setting the specific time mark when this is going to take place, which is after 62 games, as opposed to the gold plan sort of being the moment your team is eliminated from playoff contention. Now all wins and points count towards your draft potential there. So I think it's a fascinating idea. And I do think that is some of the challenge that you run into is how do you make games exciting for every team, across the board, given that you have people right now actively rooting for their team to lose. And, it worked. I mean, you had the Connor Bedard sweepstakes that went the way that Chicago wanted it to. You had prior to this the McDavid sweepstakes where the game that everyone references is the Buffalo game where the Buffalo fans are cheering every time the puck is going in their net, right? That's the kind of stuff the NHL wants to avoid. And so I really like your idea that incentivizes the continued need to play for wins and to continue to have these competitive games. My personal preference is actually Micah's tweak on the gold drafting plan, and Micah being Ineffective Math on Twitter. And I think there's a lot of merit to the idea that he gives. And so, to start, what I'll first do is kind of introduce what the gold plan is, because I think that's an important start. So the gold plan was created by Adam Gold back in 2012. It was actually presented at the MIT Sloan Sports Conference there. And essentially what the gold plan was the moment your team was eliminated, all wins or points accrued after that would go towards you being able to have the highest possible draft pick. At the end of the season, the team that had the most points after they were eliminated would be awarded first overall. Then the team that had the second most would be awarded second overall, third most being, so on and so forth, all the way down. And that's how you assign your lottery picks. And functionally, what it allows for is we know bad teams are going to get eliminated earlier. And so they have more time to accrue points. Good teams have to make a decision of sort of, are they going to continue to play out for the playoffs? And if they get eliminated, like Detroit was eliminated in the last week of the regular season, you don't have as much time to accrue points. And therefore, it's going to almost naturally weight itself to bad teams are going to get the higher picks. Good teams will not get, we'll kind of finish a little bit lower in that lottery if they ultimately don't end up making the playoffs. But what you end up having is fans are rooting for competitive games consistently. Now that's the Gold plan as presented by Adam Gold. The one tweak that Micah adds to the Gold plan that I think is fascinating is instead of waiting for a team to be eliminated before they can start accruing points, Micah proposes that a team can declare itself out of playoff contention. They can declare themselves right now, beginning of the season, I am not playing for the playoffs. And therefore, all points accrued are going to go towards that playoff, a team potentially being in that realm. And it's a fascinating twist to it where it potentially allows for teams to, declare themselves out after, maybe they have a bad 10-game stretch in November. It's pretty clear that they're not going to be in contention. We're going to go ahead and start racking up points for the draft. And it's an interesting twist. And so, Sean, I'm curious, between this and the plan you sort of proposed, what sort of led you to the one you like versus, what do you think are potentially some flaws in Micah or the original Adam Gold plan?
I like the Gold plan a lot. I do. I think it's a really smart system. I actually like Micah's twist too. If that was the future of the NHL draft seeding, I would be thrilled. That would be great. I think it's a good system. For me, the one thing that when I was looking at my system and playing around with the schedule on it was I like I'll be honest, I stole a bit from, there's a couple European soccer models where they do this, where you get at the end of the season, they have a split point. They do this in Scotland, for example, in the Scottish Premiership, where after 2/3 of the season, they split the top 6 teams, because I believe it's a 12-team league. I might be off, but it's the top division. The top 6 teams only play the top 6 teams. The bottom 6 teams only play the bottom 6 teams. And that's how the championship contenders and for the European spots are all playing each other every single week. And it's great. You get the top teams playing more often, and you get that. And then the bottom teams, even though it's not the biggest name teams playing each other all the time, every single game matters. So you're playing against your peers. And that's kind of where I kind of took a little bit of stealing part of the idea from the Gold plan concept, and then stealing a little bit of that, where I think this the reason I like my system and I throw it together is every single game is a group where they're playing for the same thing. It gets us quote unquote playoff hockey earlier of you're only playing, if you're in the top 21, you're only playing good teams. If you're in the bottom, you're playing against teams where you are directly impacting them. And because that also eliminates some of and their coaches will always, and people will always find ways to rest players and things like that at the end of the season. But I think it also creates the space where right now it's just, sometimes we get the games where you would get the Anaheim Ducks playing anyone the Ducks played in the last 13 games of the season. Anyone the Ducks played in the last 13 game season was basically a free point, and I'd have to go through their schedule to see how the Ducks impacted the playoff race. But like the Western Conference, I don't want the Ducks to have an impact on the Western Conference playoff race late in the year. Is kind of where I'm going with on this.
It makes sense. I mean, it was very similar to teams playing the Wings in 2019, 2020. Like, that was a team that was just going to get rolled over. And as the season kind of progressed, the Atlantic Division was really able to rack up a lot of points against them there. And that's a big reason why the Lightning were as successful as they were. And so it is critical to find a way to keep those teams competitive. Now, I think it is important to lay out. We've talked a lot about the positives of kind of these two models. I do think there is one major negative with both the plan you proposed and the goal drafting plan, and that's the impact on the trade deadline. Because now teams don't have an incentive to sell because they have to continue winning. So if you want a better draft pick, you want to keep your players, and if you want to make the playoffs, you want to keep your players. So, the excitement around the trade deadline definitely subsides as you're not likely to have the same amount of players moving. What I would argue, though, is I would rather take that hit to make every game competitive, as opposed to, potentially having some teams declare themselves out at the trade deadline. And now, exactly like you said, everybody Anaheim plays post-trade deadline, or everybody that Chicago played post-trade deadline, those were free points, particularly for a team that was lucky enough to have them on the schedule in that capacity. And so I think I would argue that it's still a net win for the NHL in terms of overall competitiveness and excitement, even though you do lose a bit of the drama surrounding trade deadline day.
I would also, to kind of add to your point too, though, the NHL trade deadline really isn't that exciting. I mean, like it's like this year it was nice. We saw the big market splash that the Rangers went and got Kane and Tarasenko and everything like that. But like, it's always hilarious to be like the NBA trade deadline is always like a week and a half before whatever it is, and we see Kevin Durant move to the Suns, and we see actual big trades, and it's like I could if you're a producer, like, and so it's fun, right? Sometimes it's in vogue to rip on ESPN for their hockey coverage, but to defend them on this point, one of the biggest names in the sport could be traded in the middle of the season, and the other one, we're going to trade Tanner Jeannot for 4 picks or whatever the number is, and we're going to get excited about that. Like, I think it would almost be kind of acknowledging what the NHL trade deadline really is, where it's not really that exciting. We put together these big boards and everything like that, and it was like all these trade targets and everything like that. And so often if you really took a step back and didn't try to get excited about the word trade deadline, you'd be like, this is a list of okay players. Why am I excited about this? This is not a list of good players. Typically, this is a list of okay players. Like,
yeah, I mean, to your point, I'm trying to rack my brain, and this is bad because I'm doing this off the top of my head. But like, when was the last time an elite NHL player was dealt at the trade deadline? I mean, because we've had big names move before. Like this year, Patrick Kane moves, but he is not Patrick Kane from 6 years ago. Vladimir Tarasenko is not Tarasenko from 6 years ago. Off the top of my head, like I'm going back. Is it Rick Nash going to Boston? Is it, is it Marian Hossa all the way back going to Pittsburgh in 2008? I mean, that's the kind of deals that I'm thinking about where you had like a truly elite player moving at the deadline. And it's bad that I can't remember this off the top of my head better than that, but you're absolutely right. And so if we just acknowledge the NHL trade deadline is not all it's hyped up to be anyways, and we just squash that little bit of excitement in favor of having 82 competitive games from every single hockey team, I think that's a dramatically better world. Now, there is one other sort of downstream potential negative that I think gets introduced here, and that's what happens to draft picks that are traded. If a team trades their first round draft pick, every time they win, they're actually aiding the first round draft pick that they've traded. Yeah. Because they're accumulating points towards that draft pick being better. Does that create a weird incentive? And the reason I bring this up is Micah McCurdy on his site. He has a great overview of the goal draft plan. I would encourage people to read it. But he does bring up that this is an interesting downstream complication that could exist and would potentially result in a weird outcome if the team that they had traded the draft pick to, they're playing that team are they incentivized to lose that game to not help the pick, that they've given up to that team? That's kind of a very one-off weird situation. And maybe the downstream result is you don't have those first round picks traded as much. But is that a bad thing? I don't personally think so.
Yeah, I don't think it's, it definitely is a complication. I'm fully acknowledging that, but I don't think it's as bad of a thing. It's also a space too where your draft position isn't just the first round. That's the other part too, where while you may be, in theory, you could be thinking, oh, well, we're playing for the draft position of this team because we've traded this pick away. You're not gonna. You still. How often? I often hear the word top 100 picks. Like that's the number I often hear. Where NHL GMs they feel if you want as many picks as possible in the top 100, which is. That's actually, I guess, with 32 teams now. That's the fourth pick of the fourth round. So like you want as many picks as possible in that range, and so you're gonna be. I don't think you're gonna tank. I don't think you're gonna be to try to hurt the cherry on the top you've given away to cut out away from the entire Sunday, if that makes any sense. Now it does it does have an impact. There are some teams where. They've done a lot of trading away of picks, and all of a sudden they don't really have anything, and you're like, okay, well that's an issue. What are we doing with this? But I definitely see that it would change the system of it. I think it would eventually work itself out over a couple years. Any system change, whether it's what I proposed or the gold plan or any system change, the first couple of years of it would be very weird because it would be, how do we handle what was and what becomes? And then it would kind of take probably 2 to 3 seasons for things to be normalized of what works with this system and what doesn't from how GMs handle things.
Absolutely. And what we know is teams always take a little bit of time to figure out the system, and then once they do, they'll try and exploit the loopholes. So there's probably loopholes that we haven't even thought of that would ultimately get exploited, down the line, and then that would create another interesting dynamic or interesting scenario. But functionally, I think where I'm at is right now for a mediocre team, it is hard to dig up. It is hard to get out of that, stuck in the middle of not being good enough to be in the playoffs, but not being bad enough to pick at the top. And the NHL helped it somewhat by the changes made to the draft lottery prior to last season. However, I still don't think there's enough help for some of these teams. And ultimately, in a scenario like the 2023 draft, where you have Connor Bedard as your prize for first overall, you still incentivized a lot of tanking to happen. And this, both plans we offer, I think, are potentially opportunities for the NHL to get out of that and find ways to have a little bit more competitive hockey, which is what I think everybody wants to see.
Yeah, people want a better product. Like I want to have things to root for. Like I am admittedly the big soccer guy on the show. This past Monday was the last day of the EFL Championship, which is the second division in England, and they went into I believe between 6th and 9th, there was 3 points separating teams, and there was only 2 spots available to get into the playoff for promotion. So every single game mattered, and it's one of those things where you talk about like promotion and relegation and excitement, where every game across the board matters. And it was something that it was the ridiculous thing the other day where it's like the NHL was like, oh, we'll have a day where all 32 teams play. Like, and that was somehow the big marketing plan, that having every team play a game. That was the marketing plan. Anywho, but of those, if you went through those 16 games, if we ranked them off of importance, how many of them actually mattered? Right? Like we would have had quite a list of haves and have-nots. Now, under gold plan, under the plan where we could, hey, after 62 games, you know what? Game 62, we could have all 16 games start at the exact same time, and it could be all of them would matter for the standings, it would be like, okay, is this team going to be playing is game 63 for this team going to be for the playoff race? Is game 63 going to be for the draft pick? No matter either way, it's going to be a push for this. Either way, I want more meaningful games. I want Ducks Coyotes to actually mean something beyond I want it to mean something for who's actually. I want the players' effort to be rewarded. Like that's the other part of this, where I don't want coaches and players to be in a spot where a GM is like, okay, we're not gonna give you the full tools, because we give you the full tools, you might win the game. Like, it's like, I don't want that. I want the players' effort to be rewarded. I want top down from the organization to be focused on, let's try to do something where winning the game is the most important thing. And that's just not the case, not just in hockey, just that's not the case in North American sports. In North American sports, it's winning is important, but if you're below a certain line, losing is more important, and that's more than just a hockey issue. That goes beyond every North American sport has that too.
Completely agree. You don't want to have scenarios where Jacob Chychrun is sitting for 10 days while the Arizona Coyotes look for a trade, because those are games where, under a gold draft plan or the plan you proposed, he needs to play because he's incentivized to play. You're incentivized to play him. I think if you're just a Detroit fan and you're bringing this back to that, the two games the Wings played against Ottawa the week prior to the trade deadline were the most exciting games the Wings have played in almost 7 years. And I'm not even exaggerating with that. Those were two games that had playoff implications for the Red Wings, and that was the most excitement the Wings have had around the team in a long time. And that's ultimately what you want. I don't want to sit here at the end of the season having my hopes tied to a draft lottery that is not Plinko based, and therefore I have no interest in it whatsoever. And I don't want to be left with the conclusion that, man, Steve Yzerman did not make this team bad enough to get Connor Bedard. I wish I had watched a worse team for 82 games. I don't want to be left with that. I want to be left with, that was an exciting finish to the season as the Wings really fought their heart out. They didn't make the playoffs, but they played their way into the third overall draft pick. Like that's what I want to have. That's what I want to have, that level of excitement. And you're exactly right. It rewards the players for their efforts. It doesn't incentivize, we're going to sit this guy out because he's got this minor tweak that really we just think he would help the team a little too much. Scenarios like that, we're going to get out there. We're going to try and win every game. The coaches get to do what they want to do. The players get to, play at max effort, and the organizations get rewarded for that. And ultimately, I think that's for the betterment of hockey.
It's like the weirdest space of, like, you talk about this year. Like, if you look back at one of the best stories about the Wings after the deadline was they signed Alex Chiasson out of the AHL. He signs the NHL deal. He turns into a pretty good net front power play guy for Detroit. And there's parts of you, because of where Detroit is in the world, you're like, damn, what are you doing? Like, stop. Like, be bad. Like the fact that a good story, there's people in the crowd who are looking, and there's people watching the team who are fans of the Red Wings who are like, well, damn it, Alex Chiasson, just don't do this. Be a replacement level AHL player. We should have called up someone else who would have done worse. Like, the fact that those stories, that we have to add those caveats to those stories because of this lottery system and lose for profit is ridiculous. So, the only way gold plan, my plan, whatever, something where wins are important, and at a minimum, give me a Plinko board. At minimum, give me a Plinko board.
At minimum. So really what we're trying to say here is we're the meme of the guy holding the stick, poking the NHL and saying, do something. All right? Because we've got to progress a little bit more here. The NBA has made efforts with their, with the way they've incentivized their lottery, where the three worst teams all get the same odds, and then they also have to play in. They're talking about a mid-season play-in tournament. No. Don't worry about any of that. None of that is actually relevant here. Give us a Plinko board. Give us goal drafting. Give us, the 20-game tournament. Give us something that actually will have some impact so that we can have 82 competitive hockey games, and I stop tying my emotional hope to how bad the Red Wings can be to get X player at the top of the draft next year. That's all I'm asking for. It's not much.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. It's not much to ask. It's simply asking for, we want competitive, you want hockey games that matter. You want hockey to be fun. Hockey's a game. Games are supposed to be fun. Let's do that again, please.
Exactly. With that being said, folks, we hope you had a fun time listening to this episode of Expected by Whom, where you got to hear about a Plinko board, goal drafting, women's hockey analytics opportunities. As always, if you like what we're doing and you like our show, please make sure you give us a like wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast. And if you have any comments or complaints, please direct those directly to the direct messages of Ryan Hanna on Twitter. And that's all for us, folks. We'll catch you next week.